Good evening and welcome to the special presentation, India at COP26. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. The moment that the world was anxiously waiting for, the climate summit, which will determine the direction that the world will take in the years and decades ahead, is underway in Glasgow, Scotland, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is representing India and the voice of developing countries at this crucial climate summit. The UN COP26 summit on climate change in Glasgow, UK, has begun. Delayed by about a year because of the COVID pandemic, COP26 aims to keep alive a target of capping global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. Now, this is the limit that scientists say would avoid its most destructive consequences of global warming. Prime Minister Narendra Modi was greeted by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and also UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The three leaders shared a special moment before attending the first plenary session of this climate summit.
It's possible that there's only one civilization in the Milky Way galaxy. There may only have ever been one, and there may only ever be one. And that's us. We must consider ourselves and our world to be inconceivably valuable.
And earlier, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres greeted world leaders arriving in Glasgow today for the Leaders Summit at the start of the United Nations COP26 Climate Summit. Discussions on issues such as climate change, mitigation, adaptation to irreversible environmental impacts caused by climate change, and financing to support developing countries in their efforts to move away from fossil fuels are on the forefront of the summit. Leaders were seen interacting with one another. COP26 opened a day after G20 economies failed to commit to a 2050 target to halt net carbon emissions, a deadline widely cited as necessary to prevent the most extreme global warming. And UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson opened the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of Parties or COP26 on Monday, warning the world is at 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, that we need to act now. Delivering the opening address, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the time is running out and the longer we wait to act, the worse it will become for the world, urging nations to act before it's too late.
The longer we fail to act, the worse it gets, and the higher the price when we are eventually forced by catastrophe to act, because humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now. If we don't get serious about climate change today, it will be too late for our children to do so tomorrow.
And UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson also said world leaders should seize this moment and begin to defuse the climate change bomb, turn the tide, begin the fight back.
Devote ourselves to this extraordinary task so that we not only continue with a programme that is of green industrial revolution that is already creating millions of high-wage, high-skilled jobs in power and technology, taking our economies forward. Let us also do enough to save our planet and our way of life. We may not feel much like James Bond. Not all of us necessarily look like James Bond. But we have the opportunity and we have the duty to make this summit the moment when humanity finally began, and I stress began, to defuse that bomb. And to make this the moment when we began irrefutably to turn the tide and to begin the fight back against climate change. Yes, it's going to be hard, but yes, we can do it. And so let's get to work with all the creativity and imagination and goodwill that we possess.
And in his opening remarks at the COP26, UN Chief Antonio Guterres stressed that COP26 Climate Summit must act to save humanity and protect the planet. He added that COP26 must be a moment of solidarity to financial commitments. UN Chief also called the members to keep alive the 1.5 degree temperature rise goal.
We must keep the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. This requires greater ambition on mitigation and the immediate concrete action to reduce global emissions by 45% by 2030. G20 countries have a particular responsibility as they represent around 80% of emissions. According to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in light of national circumstances, developed countries must lead the effort. But emerging economies too must go the extra mile, as their contribution is essential for the effective reduction of emissions. We need maximum ambition from all countries on all fronts to make Glasgow a success.
And UN Chief Guterres also urged members to act strongly and announced a group of experts who will give standards to realize the zero commitments by non-state actors. He also called actions to protect vulnerable communities across the globe.
I'm announcing today that we'll establish a group of experts to propose clear standards to measure and analyze net zero commitments from non-state actors. Second, we must do more to protect vulnerable communities from the clear and present dangers of climate change. Over the last decade, nearly 4 billion people suffered climate-related disasters. That devastation will only grow. But adaptation works. Early warning systems save lives. Climate-smart agriculture and infrastructure save jobs. And all donors must allocate half their climate finance to adaptation. And public and multilateral development banks should start as soon as possible.
Meanwhile, Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi called for acting decisively against climate change. He was also in favour of involving the youth, the young people, in the battle against climate change.
We need to speed up our commitment to keep the rise in temperatures below 1.5 degrees. We need to build on the G20 agreement and act faster and more decisively. We must strengthen our efforts in the realm of climate finance. We must bring together the public and the private sector in new ways. This COP26 must be the start of a new momentum, a quantum leap in our fight against climate change. And our youth must be at the center of this process. We intend to turn the Youth for Climate event we held in Milan into a regular feature of all COPs. Future generations will judge us for what we achieve or fail to achieve. We must involve them, listen to them, and above all, learn from them.
An Italian Prime Minister further added that the impact of climate change is all too evident. He said climate change has serious repercussions to global peace and security as well.
Projected rise in global temperatures is set to affect dramatically life on our planet. From catastrophic fires and floods we've seen now, to the bleaching of coral reefs, to the loss of biodiversity, the impact of climate change is already all too evident. Its price also rising fast, especially for the poorer nations. The cost of disruptions for households and companies in low and middle-income countries amounts to a staggering $390 billion a year. Climate change also has serious repercussions on global peace and security.
And earlier, Prime Minister Narendra Modi began his engagements in Glasgow, UK, by meeting the Indian community leaders and Indologists there, as well as climate change innovators from India. And he met a lot of young people. Prime Minister could be seen warmly interacting with them. This interaction took place on the sidelines of the COP26 summit. And during the interaction, a sculptor presented a bust of PM Modi to Prime Minister himself. This interaction is seen as a move to strengthen our people-to-people bonds. And let's now look at some reactions of the Indian community members, representatives who met Prime Minister Modi today in Glasgow.
I've done the sculpture of the Prime Minister because, as you can see, he's quite a popular gentleman. Everybody likes him. I really liked his features and I decided to do it. I have to say I'm very thrilled, first by his reaction, and he's obviously so easygoing. And I could not believe my improvisation the last minute were not having had glasses, because somebody said, where are the glasses? So I took off his own glasses, put it on, which I thought was a good move.
जिस दिन से मोदी जी ने योगा का शुरुआत की, इंटरनेशनल योगा डे की स्टार्ट की, उसी दिन से ही मैं जो हूँ, जो यूएनओ में पास हुआ, उनका जो है उन्होंने शुरू किया। योगा तो चल रहा है बहुत सेंचुरी से, बट पॉपुलैरिटी जो उन्होंने क्रिएट की है पूरे वर्ल्ड में, उसके लिए बहुत धन्यवाद मोदी जी को, बिकॉज उसकी वजह से जो है लोग और भी योगा करने लग गए, और इट हैज़ बीन रिकग्नाइज्ड ऑल ओवर द वर्ल्ड, विच इज़ वंडरफुल, एंड इट इज़ सो गुड फॉर नॉट ओनली फिजिकल, मेंटल एंड spiritual health for everybody. And that's the human necessity nowadays in the world, is you can have any amount of money, but you cannot have peace. So that creates a peace within us, which is wonderful. And that's what Modi ji has actually. And is amazing leader. He's an amazing Indian leader. And he's really put India top of the list, which we all appreciate. Now, India on the top of the world, which is wonderful. We are so grateful to him.
मैं बहुत ही खुशकिस्मत हूँ कि meeting such a great leader. He's one of the greatest of all the leaders that we currently have. I'm very grateful to have seen him and met him in person. So really grateful for that honor. I was delighted to meet Prime Minister Narendra Modi today, and I'm speaking not only on behalf of the Indian diaspora in Scotland, but on behalf of the Indian diaspora all over. We just love Modi ji. The vast majority of us love Modi ji. Even though we don't live in India, we have hopes, aspirations and dreams for the country, and in Modi we see a leader who will take us there.
And let's now talk about the significance and the importance of this COP26 summit underway in Glasgow, United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi is representing the voice of India. World leaders have all gathered. It's a crucial summit which is going to lay the roadmap of the road ahead as far as climate action is concerned. Two special guests are joining me for this conversation. Let me quickly introduce you to them. Mohan Kumar, former Indian ambassador. Also, Sabha Kalam, Program Manager, Climate Change and Energy, UNDP India. Good evening, gentlemen. Warm welcome to this conversation. Ambassador Kumar, if I can begin with you. How wonderful it is to see world leaders talk about climate action and express their commitment to the cause of climate change. But the concerns that United Nations has been raising after the Paris Climate Summit, that between the rhetoric and real action, there is a significant gap. What are your expectations from that perspective? What are your expectations from this edition of COP26 in Glasgow?
Thank you very much for having me. I think COP26 is going to be the most difficult climate change summit ever. Because, as you rightly said, there is such a big gap between the rhetoric of world leaders and their actual performance on the ground. I was associated with the Paris Climate Change Accords. I was India's ambassador to Paris at the time.
Right.
Paris, in retrospect, seems easier because it was only a framework agreement. And we could really use language to hide the real differences, substantial differences. The problem with Glasgow is you have got certain absences which I can only describe as geopolitical or geostrategic. China is not represented at the summit. And you know that China is the top greenhouse gas emitter of today. Russia is not represented, and Russia is in the top 5. So that leaves only United States, European Union, India, and Indonesia. And we are supposed to be the big emitters. So that is problem number 1. Problem number 2, leaders have started focusing on 1.5 degrees Celsius. As you know, in the Paris Climate Accords, we had decided that we would strive to achieve a global warming of less than 2%, which in my view is still achievable. But now the small island states and other vulnerable economies have started saying 2 degrees is not enough. You will have to target 1.5. Now, 1.5 sounds fantastic. And in an ideal world, I think we should target 1.5%. But I just want to remind your readers that viewers, that if you take the pre-industrial era as 1850 to 1900, by now we have already achieved 1.1. There is already a global warming of 1.1 degree, which has already taken place.
Right.
Now left with only 0.4 degrees Celsius if you take 1.5. And that, I would argue, is a very, very big ask. So that remains the challenge. I accept that if we go on current trends, then we will achieve 1.5 by 2040. And by the end of this century, it would have been 2.7%, which is very bad. But I think achieving 1.5 will require a gigantic effort from the developed countries. There is no point telling India that you have to do this, you have to do that, because we have our problems.
Right.
So I'll stop here and perhaps give my colleague a chance, and then I can come back.
Right. Thanks, Ambassador Kumar. I'll come back to you. Sabha Kalam, as Ambassador Kumar just mentioned, it is going to be a very, very difficult most difficult climate summit that there's ever been. If you could simplify it for our viewers, we again and again are going back to the commitment made during the Paris Climate Summit, and in the run-up to this edition of COP26, we've seen UN coming out with reports again and then saying that those commitments have not been met, the financing has not been done. If we continue to go in the manner that we are going at present, then climate catastrophe is but imminent. From the environmentalist perspective, help us understand why the pressure is so great in this edition of the Climate Summit, and why is it like a do or die moment for world leaders?
Thanks. I mean, that's a really good question. Why this COP26 is so important, and why, I mean, there is so much of expectation from COP26. Look, the main reason behind putting so much of importance to COP26 is also because of the operationalization of the Paris Agreement. And that's why, I mean, it's been said that it's going to be a make or the break year. The UNSG in his remarks, I mean, he very wisely used one sentence where he said there is a lack of credibility and a lot of confusion, which basically is going to, not going to, but perhaps, I mean, might shadow the discussion which is happening between the developed countries and the developing countries. As Mr. Kumar, I mean, detailed out the repercussions of the current emission levels by mid-century as well as by end century. This is going to be the last shot by the developed and the developing countries to reach an agreement on two things. One is raising the ambition, because with the current ambition, the world is sure that we are not going to come near to 2 degrees even. I mean, forget about 1.5 degrees. So of course, I mean, the ambition needs to be increased by everyone, not only by developing countries. The second is to enhance the ambition, you need resources. You need resources in all forms, not only financial resources, but technical resources as well. Now, who is going to provide the technical resources? Of course, people who have the resources and who have earlier committed for the resources.
Right.
And that's the developed country's responsibility. I mean, UK being a developed country, they also have a responsibility being host of the COP26 to build the credibility among the developing countries that, yes, I mean, we are there for you. We want to fight it together. It's not that we have now developed and we have taken the major share of the carbon budget, and now you have to reduce. I mean, with that kind of a discussion, I mean, of course, we won't be able to reach an agreement. So everybody will have to go an extra mile. But perhaps, I mean, in this COP26, developed countries have more responsibility because the earlier commitments have not been met by them.
Right. And Ambassador Kumar, the opening address by Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister, he had a line to say, he said something like, get real about climate change. This is the time. I mean, that's telling and that's also disturbing. We are talking about an impending imminent climate catastrophe, and leaders still have to come on board to sort of accept the kind of urgency on board. But he also talks about how this challenge can be handled. He says we have the ideas, we have the technology, and we have the banks, referring to the challenges of financing. Help us understand, sir, from the Paris Climate Summit, when such ambitious targets were listed out, $100 billion a year, which cumulative also we haven't been able to see, what went wrong and where? Because similar commitments were made earlier as well. I'm just trying to understand how Glasgow rhetoric is going to be different from Paris.
So I think two things happen. One is that countries were not able to sacrifice as much as they should have. And I'm referring primarily to developed countries. They were not able to do as much as they should have under the Paris Agreement. The second thing that happened was COVID, frankly.
Yes.
And COVID has taken off a valuable 2 years from the time frame that is available for countries to act. And I think that is why I worry about the rhetoric, because it's going to take another 2 years at least for countries to fully recover from the pandemic. To ask countries to make a sacrifice at this time, even accepting that climate change is a top priority for all countries, a more important priority, if I may argue, is the livelihood issue.
Yes.
People are out of jobs. Poverty has increased significantly. Inequalities of income and wealth have augmented very substantially thanks to COVID. It is the priority of governments now to make sure that people don't actually go towards absolute and miserable poverty, and that people have to get their jobs back. Livelihoods have to be restored. Employment has to be restored. This is the top priority for all leaders. They may say things in COP26, and I accept it. But this is where I think the idea of climate justice that Prime Minister Modi keeps talking about is relevant. The richer countries have an obligation, a fundamental obligation to do more because they have created the historical emissions, not India, not least developed countries. So they ought to do more. So the carbon space that has been occupied by rich countries has to be vacated in favor of India, in favor of other countries. And that is why I'm a little skeptic because of, number one, COVID, because of the geopolitical absence of China and Russia, which are two top countries who need to be frankly negotiating. And you can't negotiate these things online. And I'm in any case told that the Chinese president is only going to read out a speech. He's going to submit a written speech. Okay. He's not going to appear online. So I think there are issues, frankly, Mr. Ghosh. I wish COP26 very well. I think one has to understand that the environment and the climate, no pun intended, in which this conference is taking place is the economic recovery, post-pandemic economic recovery is going to dominate the agenda of governments.
Right. The themes that you've mentioned, Ambassador Kumar, makes me want to just go back a day back when the G20 concluded and the declaration came out. Also, some of the highlights were mentioned by India's Sherpa Union Minister Piyush Goyal. You mentioned livelihood that featured significantly in the declaration. A sustainable lifestyle consumption, curbing energy-intensive lifestyle. Those were phrases that were mentioned. I'm just trying to understand when the most powerful countries have just met, concluded the G20 summit, and what came out of it. Does that make you hopeful about what the world can achieve in COP26?
If I am absolutely honest, no. Because what the G20 did was to reaffirm commitments which have already been made in Paris.
Broadly, yes, yes.
Iterated the commitment. But actual the way COP26 works, Mr. Ghosh, and this changed in Paris. Until Paris, the leaders only came towards the end of the summit. But now the leaders come in the beginning of the summit, make their speeches and declarations, and then they disappear, leaving the negotiators to do the actual nuts and bolts of negotiations. So frankly, you will have to wait and see. There is a 10-day period after today, during which actual negotiations are going to be conducted by climate change negotiators. They will do the nuts and bolts of it. So far, what you are hearing is broad commitments by leaders. They have...
Ambassador Kumar, I'll just stop you for a moment. US President Joe Biden is speaking at the moment in the climate summit. We go across live to what he has to say.
Faire partie de cette dynamique et aussi de cette transformation. À nous, décideurs politiques ici rassemblés à Glasgow, de ne pas être plus frileux que nos populations prêtent souvent à aller plus loin que nous. En outre, pour être un succès, Glasgow doit absolument agir et dégager un accord sur, premièrement, les règles relatives au marché du carbone et deuxièmement, la synchronisation des calendriers pour mettre à jour les contributions nationales. Mon pays, le Luxembourg, continuera à relever le défi avec détermination. Nous avons rehaussé à 55% notre...
All right, we'll just get you in a moment what US President Joe Biden had to say in his intervention. Let's continue with the conversation. Sabah, if I can come to you. Just to trying to understand how the Paris Climate Summit was not like a finished summit in itself. It sort of was a beginning of a lot of understanding and commitments that were yet to be made by countries in the days and years ahead. One particular commitment is about nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that the nations were supposed to spell out their emission goals and act on it. If you could just help us understand and simplify the manner in which these climate summits, COP summits are organized, the way in which framework, the vision is listed, and then over the years that is expected to take shape, because we're just trying to understand the gap between when the vision is stated and when the real action takes place.
Yeah, I'll just step back. I mean, not from 2015, but
Sure.
Much earlier, I would say, I mean, starting from 2000. You know, I mean, the entire climate negotiation has evolved dramatically, where, I mean, when we started our initial COP, the idea was that every country is going to reduce its emission. They'll have to have commitments, peaking year, all of that. And every country was expected to do that. And there was a lot of pressure from the developed countries for the developing countries to commit for emission reduction, go for peaking year, all of that. But over the years, I mean, how the negotiation has evolved, I mean, it's been very clear that this can't be dictated by the developed countries. Developing countries, I mean, they form their own blocks, they form their own groups, and they fought it very gracefully in past, I would say, almost like 10, 15 years. And that's how, I mean, it was agreed that rather than having a formal commitment by the countries, it should be contribution by the countries, that how the countries are going to contribute to reduce emissions. And it will be like a determined contribution, nationally determined contribution by the countries, rather than a formal commitment. Now, these contributions, I mean, do not only talk about emission reduction or say renewable energy. It also talks about how the countries are going to adapt. What are their plans in terms of the technology transfer? What they see as a priority for the country overall, if not globally. And that's how, I mean, NDC came in, and then every country submitted NDCs. Now, even before the Paris Agreement started, I mean, there was a lot of confusion. I mean, the confusion which was there before the Paris Agreement was somewhat similar to what is happening today in COP26 as well. People were not sure whether we are going to get a concrete outcome out of the Paris COP or not. But towards the end of the COP, we realized that, I mean, it's going to be a big sort of a decision made in form of an agreement. And that was a remarkable year for everybody. Now, when Paris Agreement came in place and NDCs were submitted, now, I mean, every country will have to revise their NDCs if they have given NDCs till 2025. But for a country like India, which has given its NDC till 2030, which are already sort of an ambitious NDC, right. And India is fighting back, saying that, I mean, we already have, I mean, ambitious NDCs and we really can't revise it. Some of the countries which have really given some low-hanging kind of NDC targets, I mean, they are now being able to update or revise their NDCs, and globally, I mean, they are seen as the leaders because I mean, they have now updated or revised their NDCs. Rather than the responsibility, it's been seen as the announcements which are critical for such meetings. So we should not be aiming at only announcements. We should be aiming at who is doing how much, and what are the responsibilities of each country. And that's where, I mean, India has really worked well in past few years, whether it's goal 3, NDC goal 3 on emission intensity, or goal 4 on reducing fossil fuel dependence. So, I mean, that's been remarkable in terms of the achievement that India has made. So it should be judged by that rather than just an announcement of NDC enhancement or updating NDCs.
Right. Ambassador Kumar, in the beginning of our conversation, when you said that this is going to be a very, very difficult, challenging and therefore an important climate summit, we also read in that your concern for the developing countries. We know the climate crisis is for the planet, but climate mitigation efforts puts different kind of pressure on developed countries and developing countries, and because of which certain commitments were made earlier, whether it is commitments to finance such mitigation efforts or provide technology for such initiatives. Given that the promises were not kept, how does that make the scene for the developing countries, India included, more challenging as compared to more richer countries in the summit?
So, thank you for posing that question. India faces what I call a classic climate dilemma. And the dilemma is as follows. First, we have not been responsible for historical legacy emissions. Point number one. Point number two, our current emissions are just growing. We haven't peaked, but it's growing. There is no question about it. We need it for developmental priorities within the country. The third point is, frankly, that we are also the worst victims of climate change. Our coastal regions are affected by floods. We have more droughts, and every single prediction says by 2070, India and Sub-Saharan Africa and West Asia will be the worst water-stressed regions of the world. So climate change will affect India in a way that is almost impossible to contemplate by 2050. The dilemma for India is, how do you then operate when, as you say, the developed countries are not transferring money, technology is not being made accessible, and yet demands are being made on India that we will have to move to net zero. That is the real dilemma for India. So I would say that we would have to do things like, for example, I'm eagerly waiting for the Prime Minister's announcement of the nationally determined contributions that India is going to announce in Glasgow. One of them, I hope, is the fact that we can establish 450 gigawatts of renewable energy or non-fossil energy by 2030. If we can do that, then I think we can demonstrate to COP26 that, listen, India is part of the solution. We are not part of the problem. In fact, the worst victims of climate change. The second thing that India can do, and I think Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Johnson are going to launch a Green Grids initiative.
Right.
The Grids initiative is going to be the operationalization of the International Solar Alliance. If that can be done, again, we can demonstrate that we are part of the solution. But having said all of this, Mr. Ghosh, frankly, we need the critical enablers, which are finance and technology. And that, I think, the developed countries are duty bound to give us under the Paris Accords. That will have to be done sooner or later if countries like India have to fulfill their commitments in all fullness and integrity.
Right. Sabha, Ambassador, the point that Ambassador Kumar mentioned, the manner in which India has worked hard towards climate mitigation efforts to make sure that it's part of the solution and not the problem. The ambitious 450 gigawatts of renewable energy commitment by the end of the decade, leadership in the International Solar Alliance. We also have one of the world's highest installed capacity of renewable energy. All these efforts that India has made, is it possible to see it in a context of global efforts that have been made towards climate mitigation? Is it possible to clearly understand the nations which are really trying to be part of the solution and not the problem, just to sort of figure out where then the problem lies and where is it that more action is required?
Yeah, I think, India has done more than what it was required to do, I would say, in that way. 450 gigawatt of renewable energy, emission intensity reduction, International Solar Alliance, then CDRI, which is disaster risk infrastructure. These are some of the steps which India has taken in past few years, which have been acknowledged at the world level. And really, most of the people who came before COP26 to meet Government of India, they recognized the contribution of the Government of India in fighting climate change, and that was very clear. Everybody appreciates that. But yeah, as Mr. Kumar also said, that the critical part for India is that amidst everything, whatever India is doing, whatever India has done in the past, one of the small expectation, despite being a developing country, one of the small expectation from India was to get proper financing for adaptation as well as for mitigation, as well as transfer of critical technologies. Now, on mitigation, India has gone far ahead. On adaptation, it has been dependent completely on domestic resources, only on public financing, mostly Government of India resources. Now, countries like India are going to suffer the most, especially the coastal regions, especially people who are dependent on agriculture, on water resources. But if you see, most of the funding which comes in, the adaptation part is really minuscule. It's just peanut. It's nothing. Whereas countries like India need to adapt more than to mitigate. And that's where India feels really bad while going to these discussions. And they want to very gracefully, they put their point across through words like climate justice, fair share, all of that. But had it been some other country, I mean, they would have put their point across very aggressively that we have done more than what we were supposed to do, and we are just expecting a little bit from you, which we have not received. I think, I mean, that's the responsibility of the developed world to show some level of confidence to the developing countries that, yes, I mean, whatever you are doing, we are part of it as well.
Right. Ambassador Kumar, I want to return to the point that you just made about the financing and technology transfer to developing countries. Now, it is really disturbing to witness the manner in which the dynamics between rich and poorer countries, rich and developing country plays out even in times of global crisis. For a moment, let's talk about the pandemic. G20, we were talking about how equitable distribution of vaccines hasn't happened. 3% of the population in poorer countries have managed to get access to the vaccine as compared to 70% in richer countries. That's telling about how resources are even shared across the world. Now, coming to the climate change theme and the theme of providing funding, providing technology, while all leaders recognize the climate crisis, we are still part of the same world order. How is it going to pan out differently for climate change if that dynamics continue to remain as it was always?
I think the dynamics is changing. Mm-hmm. It is not changing fast enough. That's the problem. The dynamics is certainly changing. I must be fair. I wouldn't say that compared to 2015, the Paris Accords were finalized in 2021, 6 years. I think there has been some progress. I think the problem that we are grappling with is that the progress is insufficient. Problem number one. Problem number two is the pandemic, which has set us back by 2 years. And problem number three is actually the emphasis on mitigation, but not emphasis on adaptation. Poorer countries, developing countries, India, we would like more attention, more funding for adaptation, not just mitigation. Mitigation is important, but adaptation is equally important. So one of the things that India has done, for example, the Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, is about adaptation. So I think it is fair to say some progress has happened. However, progress is highly insufficient. At the same time, ambition has increased. As I said, in Paris, it was less than 2 degrees. Suddenly, I find that people are repeating the 1.5 degrees mantra as if it were an article of faith. And I have to be honest with you. Current funding, current technology transfer is not enough for 1.5%. We need much more. So that is where you will find a gap between the rhetoric of leaders and actual performance on the ground. And then you've got the youth activists, led by Greta Thunberg and others, who are actually introducing what is known as climate cynicism. Basically, the activists are telling the leaders, you are all blah, blah. You're not doing anything. And that's not a very good situation to be in, because we need to have the confidence of everybody, the non-governmental activists, the governmental leaders, the rich countries, as you say, developing countries. And don't forget, there is also an association of small island countries, Barbados, Fiji, Antigua, Barbuda. Now, those are countries which believe in high climate ambition. In fact, they are the ones who are driving the 1.5% Celsius degree. They say, if you do 2 degrees, we will not exist. So you need to do 1.5%. Now, the problem, as I said, with 1.5% is we have already increased from pre-industrial levels by 1.1%. So you are only giving me a margin of 0.4%. Whereas in India's case, as you know, more than 60% of our electricity is generated by coal.
Right.
We are trying desperately to reduce that by increasing solar energy, wind energy, hydrothermal, and so on. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think India can get rid of coal. Nobody is suggesting that it should consign coal to history. So those are the, as I said earlier, India represents the classic climate dilemma. We are not responsible for historical emissions. We are trying to be part of the solution, yet we are being told that coal is a big issue and you must not be part of the problem. That is the kind of politics of climate change, if you like. It is the geopolitics of climate change which actually represents India's dilemma at these talks. It'll be interesting to see how India puts forward a nationally determined contribution at Glasgow.
And in this politics of climate change, as you put it, Ambassador Kumar, again, do you see some silver lining? Again, I want to go back to some of the points of the declaration of the G20, because they again are those powerful economies that determine a lot of what happens in the world. When it was said that it is the developed countries who have to ambitiously achieve the net zero commitments ahead of the developing countries, and not just net zero, be more ambitious, seek net negative emissions as well. So the kind of statement that was made yesterday, do you think, at least to begin with, it sort of lays a foundation for developing countries to have some space to realistically set targets and work towards them?
I think the operational word in your statement is realistically, which you just mentioned. If you're going to ask me to be realistic, I would say because of the pandemic situation, net negative is going to be difficult. What I would request and demand from the developed countries is advancing the date of net zero. I have always felt net zero at 2050 is too late. They should really be doing net zero by 2030. China should be doing net zero by 2040. And then maybe India can be asked to do net zero by 2070. That would be reasonable in my view. But to ask India to do the same thing as United States and others who are doing net zero by 2050 is, I think, grossly unfair. Because we are not in the same situation as United States, UK, or even China. So that is what I'm saying. If you are realistic, don't expect these developed countries to be net negative. They are not going to do that, although we can make that demand on them. But ask them to do net zero much before 2050. 2050 is too late. They can do net zero by 2030 or 2035. And then maybe put pressure on China, because the thing about China, I know that China and India are often bracketed together. Again, I want to tell your viewers that this is grossly unfair. China is responsible for 27% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the world today. India is responsible for less than 7%, 6.6 to be precise. Where is 6.6%? And where is 27% for countries which have roughly the same population? And that is why the absence of China and the absence of Russia, which is also a big player because it's an energy supplier, it's a big emitter of greenhouse gases as well. I think that for me is bad news, because we really need to negotiate these things hard with China. But I think, having said that, if you want me to see a silver lining, I would say if developed countries tomorrow say, or in end of Glasgow, if they can say, okay, we think 2050 is too late, we will try to do net zero before that, that would be wonderful news for the climate. But barring that, I don't see how we can achieve 1.5%. We can try. And we can, we can hope for some technological miracle to happen, because technology can always change things and there can be a paradigm shift. But barring that, I think developed countries will have to take the lead at Glasgow.
Right. Sabha, just keeping the discussion in the realm of the realistic going forward, I just want to quickly quote from this United Nations Environment Programme emission gap report that came about a week or so ago, and just some pointers from it. It talks about how, and it raises concern about the commitments made by the nations across the world. It says fossil fuel production is not slowing at the rate needed. Now, I elaborate on that. It says major economies, developed economies, are set to produce more than double the amount of coal, oil and gas in 2030. Now, Ambassador Kumar was making a point about the developed countries raising the bar for themselves, seeking to achieve net zero earlier than the rest of the world, and even aim for net negative. But here the UN report seems to be saying something completely contrary. We are saying there's an increasing commitment parallelly. I mean, there is, of course, work done in climate mitigation as well, but as far as fossil fuels, which are the single most significant sources of emissions, their consumption by the developed countries is not taking a downward turn.
That's very true. I mean, if you see starting from 1850 till 2019, the world has emitted approximately around 2,500 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Yeah. And out of the 2,500 billion tons of the CO2 that we have pumped into the atmosphere, nearly 60% is by the developed countries, which is nearly about 18% of the world population. Now, with that logic, if you go, the remaining carbon space that we have now, I mean, the developed countries are saying that let's now divide among ourselves whatever is remaining. And as Mr. Kumar said, that, I mean, let's be carbon neutral by 2050. That will help us to be within the 2 degrees temperature rise target. Now, that I don't see, I mean, that's a fair ask, because till now the developed countries have utilized most of the carbon space. And now whatever is remaining for the developing countries, or whatever is remaining as a carbon space, that should effectively be used by the developing countries to reach the same level where we have in terms of the economic development, where we have the developed countries right now. So it's not going to be really fair to ask developing countries to altogether, everybody, let's be carbon neutral by 2050. I mean, that's not a fair ask. If you're going to ask countries to become carbon neutral by 2050, especially the developing countries, then the developed countries will have to show greater ambition by going carbon neutral by 2030, or even before that as well. Then only, I mean, they have a sense, they have a logic to ask developing countries to go carbon neutral by 2050 or 2060. Everybody going carbon neutral by 2050, 2060, that's going to be something for developing countries which can't be really negotiated. And, I mean, even if we are going to say, I mean, reach the temperature rise above 2 degrees, then also countries, developing countries specifically, will need economic development to tackle the changes that will happen at that point of time at the end of the century. So with both the logic, I mean, even if we are reaching 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, or even if we don't reach 2 degrees target, in both the cases, developing countries need fair share for their own economic development.
Right. Ambassador Kumar, it's very interesting the point that you just made about how technology can be a game changer in finding solutions to the climate crisis. Now, a lot of things that I just want to digress just a little. A lot of things that we see these days as far as technological advancements are concerned, it sort of really looks like science fiction. We're flying helicopters, mini helicopters on a different planet, which is astonishing, which is wonderful, and will help us achieve many things. But is the absence of technology the only hindrance? Is it also not the will to share the technology that is available? I mean, if I, as a developed country, as a prosperous country, have access to a technology, say for instance an affordable electric car technology, am I simply going to hand over that technology to a developing country or my neighbor with feeling that common commitment to climate change, or is it again going to play out through the lens of international relations and economics and future of prosperity? How do you see it becoming complicated when international sort of dynamics come into place, and not just absence of climate technology?
So there are, I think, two significant impediments to transfer of technology, and have been well documented. One is intellectual property rights.
Yes.
They stand in the way. If a private sector company which has patents on the technology, the governments in Western countries will just throw up their hands and say, sorry, we can't control. We cannot tell Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates how he should share the technology.
As is the case in the vaccine case in COVID-19. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think intellectual property rights is issue number one. Issue number two is even assuming that developed countries say, okay, we will waive the intellectual property rights and we will request the company to share it, the cost is going to be exorbitant because private sector will not do it just because it cares for the environment. If there is a valuable invention. So my point is, I actually think a lot of this innovation now must happen in countries like India. India has a large enough engineering and STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, mathematics reservoir, so that if we can innovate at home, that is much better. So that is one thing that can happen. Two areas where I'm hopeful. One is green hydrogen, and technology related to green hydrogen can make a very big difference. And the Prime Minister of India has already talked of a world or a global hydrogen coalition. This is going to be, again, I think, mentioned by the Prime Minister in his statement. So we are part of a global hydrogen coalition. And I must tell your viewers that hydrogen is the fuel of the future. And if India can invest in research, and if others can invest in research, that is number one. Number two, I would say, is carbon capture and storage. Because unfortunately for countries like India, we cannot get rid of coal completely. So if somehow there can be technological advances in carbon capture and storage, then at least our coal plants with supercritical technology can emit much less than normal coal plants. And that by carbon capture and storage, we can at least make the air much better, even with coal plants. So these two technological innovations can be game changers. There are several other game changers, but I go back to a fundamental obligation by the developed countries that they must fulfill their commitment of $100 billion to be transferred annually to developing and least developed countries immediately. It was supposed to be done by 2020. We are now 2021. And if you're not going to do it, then it's a big, big problem for developing and least developed countries. And it would be unfair to ask poor countries to foot the bill, especially when they are devoting a substantial part of their resources to post-pandemic economic recovery.
The kind of ecosystem for startups that has come into being, perhaps our next solutions are for climate mitigation are also going to come from there. And Sabha, if you could also inform us a little more about talking about innovations, what are these new developments taking place in the country that often we don't get to hear about, but are playing a key role in mitigation efforts in the country, indigenous development, research, if you could take us through that.
Yeah, I'll especially, put forward what youths are doing right now, starting with youths. They have significant contribution in terms of innovations made on mitigation, whether it's carbon capture or whether it's straight away mitigating climate change through emission reduction. So there have been a lot of technological advances at the higher level where industries are involved, but especially small innovations which are happening at a community level, at a very lower level, which are right now very much at the prototype stage, which needs to be scaled up exponentially if you really want to see some changes. Apart from mitigation, I'll also bring in adaptation, because this is something which we have been doing from past centuries, I would say, Mitigation, of course, I mean, we are trying to do right now. We have been doing it from past couple of decades. But adaptation, where communities are involved, where farmers are involved, they have been adapting to climate change significantly. And they have been doing whatever they can, I mean, in terms of the crops they are growing, or in terms of meeting the demand of water in absence of groundwater particularly. So those kind of innovations which are happening at every level, not only at the community level, but at the level of youths, at the level of government, at the level of civil societies. And perhaps, I mean, this is what is required as well to tackle such a big issue. We need contribution from
Right.
everybody.
Right. On that note, Sabha Kalam, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, thanks very much for joining us in the program, sharing your insights and perspective on climate change and the mitigation efforts required. But our conversation and this special presentation on India at COP26 continues. Moving ahead, let's get a better understanding of what COP26, the summit, this climate summit, is all about.
26 is the 2021 edition of the United Nations Annual Climate Change Conference. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. Parties are the signatories of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a treaty agreed in 1994 which has 197 parties, 196 countries and the European Union. The 2021 conference will be the 26th meeting of the parties, which is why it's called as COP26. The United Nations Climate Change Conferences are among the largest international meetings in the world. The negotiations between governments are complex and involve officials from every country in the world as well as representatives from civil society and the global news media. Activities at a COP takes place in two different zones, the blue zone and the green zone. The blue zone is for people registered with the UN body tasked with coordinating the global response to the threat of climate change, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the blue zone, you might be part of a national delegation, work for the United Nations and related organizations and agencies, or be a member of the media or non-profit observer organization. In the blue zone, delegates from countries meet for both formal negotiations and informal consultations. The green zone is for the general public. There will be a wide range of events, including workshops, art exhibitions and installations, as well as presentations, demonstrations of technology and musical performances for everyone to attend. The Paris Agreement was agreed at COP21 in 2015. For the first time ever, it saw almost every country around the world enter into a legally binding commitment to reduce emissions. It was top-down in that every country, no matter how big or small, signed up to cutting carbon emissions to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and
भारत समेत अधिकतर विकासशील देशों के किसानों के लिए क्लाइमेट बड़ी चुनौती है। क्रॉपिंग पैटर्न में बदलाव आ रहा है। बेसमय बारिश और बाढ़ या लगातार आ रहे तूफानों से फसलें
to those developing nations that are more impacted by climate change. Just like in India, climate is a big challenge for the agricultural sector of most developing countries. There are changes in the cropping pattern, untimely rains and floods, or crop is being destroyed by regular typhoons. From sources of drinking water to affordable housing, all need to be made resilient against climate change. Excellencies, I have three views in this regard. First, we will need to make adaptation the key component of our development policies and projects. In India, our various projects like Tap Water for All, Clean India Mission, and Clean Cooking Fuel for All have not only provided
महत्व मिलना चाहिए। ज्ञान का ये प्रवाह नई पीढ़ी तक भी जाए, इसके लिए स्कूल के सिलेबस में भी इसे जोड़ा जाना चाहिए। लोकल कंडीशन के अनुरूप लाइफस्टाइल्स का संरक्षण भी एडेप्टेशन का एक महत्वपूर्ण स्तंभ हो सकता है। तीसरा, एडेप्टेशन के तरीके चाहे लोकल हो, कितने पिछड़े देशों को इनके लिए ग्लोबल सपोर्ट मिलना चाहिए। लोकल एडेप्टेशन के लिए ग्लोबल सपोर्ट की सोच के साथ ही भारत ने कोएलिशन फॉर डिजास्टर रेजिस्टेंट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर (CDRI) की पहल की थी। मैं सभी देशों को इस इनिशिएटिव के साथ जुड़ने का अनुरोध करता हूं। धन्यवाद।
Thank you very much, Narendra. Thank you, Prime Minister Modi. Let's go now to Joe Biden, President of the United States of America.
Well, thank you very much.
नमस्कार डीडी न्यूज पर आप दो टूक देख रहे हैं मैं हूं अशोक
And that was intervention by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the ongoing COP26 climate summit. In his address, Prime Minister highlighted some key points, especially from the perspective of developing countries like India. The greater focus was on adaptation, adapting to the challenge that the climate change crisis puts forth to different regions of the world. He highlighted the challenges faced by marginalized farmers in the country, particularly the manner in which cropping pattern is being affected for smaller farmers. He spoke about the different resources, different programs that are being organized in India to make this adaptation possible at the ground level. He referred to the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, drinking water target that India has set up. He also talked about how climate change initiatives, mitigation efforts must now become a part of mainstream discourse. By that, he referred to how in education and in school syllabus, youngsters must grow up reading and understanding about how climate change efforts are absolutely crucial part of their lives. And he highlighted the importance of adaptation also by saying that global support for local adaptation is going to be a crucial way forward if we are to successfully mitigate the climate crisis that faces us all. Those were some of the key points that Prime Minister mentioned in his intervention at the COP26 summit that is going on. Going back to the understanding that we were trying to create about COP26, let's understand what are the objectives of this climate summit, COP26, what does it seek to achieve in the years and decades ahead? Let's take a look at this special report.
Countries are being asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets that align with reaching net zero by the middle of the century. To deliver on these stretching targets, countries will need to accelerate the phase out of coal, curtail deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles, encourage investment in renewables. The climate is already changing and it will continue to change even as nations reduce emissions with devastating effects. At COP26, countries need to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to protect and restore ecosystems, build defenses, warning systems and resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods and even lives. To deliver on the first two goals, developed countries must deliver on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance every year by 2020. International finance institutions must play their part and all need to work towards unleashing the trillions in the private and public sector finance required to secure global net zero. Support for developing countries. Developing countries in particular need support, and this must include building new markets for adaptation and mitigation and improving the quantity, quality and access to finance to support communities around the world to take action on the climate change. Task Force on Access to Climate Finance. At the Climate and Developmental Ministerial convened by the UK COP26 presidency on 31st March 2021, participants recognized the urgent need to streamline access to climate finance with greater individual and collective action required both before and following COP26. The Task Force on Access to Climate Finance was announced in response to calls for coherent and effective support for developing countries' efforts to decarbonize their economies, adapt to climate change and establish green growth pathways. Nations can only rise to the challenge of the climate crisis by working together. At COP26, the world must finalize the Paris Rulebook. World nations must find a solution on carbon markets by creating a robust system of carbon credits that support the move to net zero, resolve the issues of transparency by putting in place a universal system that encourages all countries to keep to their commitments, broker an agreement that drives ambition from governments over the coming years to keep 1.5 degrees alive, accelerate action to tackle the climate crisis through collaboration between governments, businesses and civil society. Bureau Report, DD India.
So that was a ready reckoner sort of a thing on COP26, what this climate summit is all about, what are the targets and what does it seek to achieve. We take forward a conversation on India at COP26. A fresh panel is joining us now. Let me quickly introduce you to them. We have with us Manjeev Puri, former senior diplomat, Professor P.K. Joshi, Environmental Studies Department at JNU, and Suruchi Badwal, Director, Earth Sciences and Climate Change, Delhi. Good evening and warm welcome to all of you. Ambassador Puri, we just heard briefly Prime Minister's intervention at COP26. his intervention and the point that he made about global support for local adaptation. That's telling. If you could sort of just help us simplify and elaborate as to how does that work for India, and when I say India, I also mean a lot of developing countries who share common concerns.
Shubhendu, thank you very much. I want to say that this little excerpt that we heard of the Honorable Prime Minister has gladdened my heart a great deal. Adaptation is the other side of climate change, yet the entire world remains fixated on mitigation. And I am so glad that at his level, he raised this issue and made it crystal clear in front of the global leaders. Now, what is adaptation? Adaptation is what you have to do with climate change, which is in any case confronting you. Let's look at this very simply. The last year, as a result of COVID, saw some of the slowest growths in the economies, in fact, the largest slowdowns in global economies that the world has seen in decades. And yet, did climate change really finish or slow down? Not at all. Instead, we've had devastating fires, cyclones, all kinds of other difficult weather events taking place. And why does this happen? It happens because the warming that the Earth is facing is basically there as a result of the accumulation of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And these remain in the atmosphere for very long periods of time, indeed for decades on. So, while current emissions are important, nothing is as important as the stock of carbon dioxide, which in fact is something that has been accumulated over a century as a result of industrial.
Right, Ambassador Puri, I'll just hold you for a moment. Let's listen in once again Prime Minister's intervention at COP26.
एडेप्टेशन के महत्वपूर्ण मुद्दे पर मुझे अपने विचार प्रस्तुत करने का अवसर देने के लिए माय फ्रेंड बोरिस, थैंक यू। वैश्विक क्लाइमेट डिबेट में एडेप्शन को उतना महत्व नहीं मिला है जितना मिटिगेशन को। यह उन विकासशील देशों के साथ अन्याय है जो क्लाइमेट चेंज से अधिक प्रभावित है। भारत समेत अधिकतर विकासशील देशों के किसानों के लिए क्लाइमेट बड़ी चुनौती है। क्रॉपिंग पैटर्न में बदलाव आ रहा है। बेसमय बारिश और बाढ़ या लगातार आ रहे तूफानों से फसलें तबाह हो रही हैं। पेयजल के स्रोत से लेकर अफोर्डेबल हाउसिंग तक सभी को क्लाइमेट चेंज के खिलाफ रेजिलिएंट बनाने की जरूरत है। एक्सेलेंसी, इस संदर्भ में मेरे 3 विचार हैं। पहला, एडेप्टेशन को हमें अपनी विकास नीतियों और परियोजनाओं का मुख्य अंग बनाना होगा। भारत में नल से जल, टैप वाटर फॉर ऑल, स्वच्छ भारत, क्लीन इंडिया मिशन और उज्ज्वला क्लीन कुकिंग फ्यूल फॉर ऑल जैसी परियोजनाओं से हमारे जरूरतमंद नागरिकों को एडेप्टेशन बेनिफिट्स तो मिले ही हैं, उनकी क्वालिटी ऑफ लाइफ में भी सुधार है। दूसरा, कई ट्रेडिशनल कम्युनिटीज में प्रकृति के साथ सामंजस्य में रहने का ज्ञान है। हमारी एडेप्टेशन नीतियों में इन पारंपरिक प्रैक्टिसेस को उचित महत्व मिलना चाहिए। ज्ञान का ये प्रवाह नई पीढ़ी तक भी जाए, इसके लिए स्कूल के सिलेबस में भी इसे जोड़ा जाना चाहिए। लोकल कंडीशन के अनुरूप लाइफस्टाइल्स का संरक्षण भी एडेप्टेशन का एक महत्वपूर्ण स्तंभ हो सकता है। तीसरा, एडेप्टेशन के तरीके चाहे लोकल हो, कितने पिछड़े देशों को इनके लिए ग्लोबल सपोर्ट मिलना चाहिए। लोकल एडेप्टेशन के लिए ग्लोबल सपोर्ट की सोच के साथ ही भारत ने कोएलिशन फॉर डिजास्टर रेजिस्टेंट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर CDRI की पहल की थी। मैं सभी देशों को इस इनिशिएटिव के साथ जुड़ने का अनुरोध करता हूं। धन्यवाद।
All of that was once again Prime Minister's interventions at the upcoming COP26 summit. Ambassador Puri, if you could please complete the point that you were making when I had to stop you.
Thank you, Shubhendu. Once again, the same point highlighted. The importance, in fact, the imperative for adaptation, because climate change is here to stay and it's not stopping even as a result of global slowdown. In fact, let me say this very simply. Action on adaptation naturally would have to be local, but its support must be global, because the cause of climate change is a global issue. And it is as a result of a global situation which has been created mostly by the industrialized country. Now, I think the fact that at the level of the Prime Minister, this thing has been raised in the highest particular plenary in the COP. I hope that this particular COP in Glasgow, other than focusing on the things that you mentioned, which are essentially mitigation, raised ambition in terms of reducing the greenhouse gases which are produced, I hope that this COP will also focus on adaptation, something which has been promised, but in the past never walked. And I think we hope that the adaptation talk will be walked this particular time.
Right. Suruchi Badwal, ma'am, if I can come to you. I think it's when we start talking about the theme of adaptation is when we embrace the reality of climate change, especially in the manner in which it has played out in developing countries. Ma'am, if you could take us through in a little more detail the glimpses of those changes that Prime Minister hinted about, the manner in which our farmers are facing the challenge of climate change right now, more urgently, the manner in which developing policies are being shaped, keeping in mind the changes that have already been noticed vis-a-vis climate change. What are these impacts that the developing countries, that India, for instance, is experiencing, that makes adaptation a buzzword, a key point in all development policies and vision creation?
So thank you very much. I would like to start by saying I'm quite thrilled today, actually, hearing the Prime Minister talk about adaptation. And it's been a long time for us to see adaptation being pitched at that level, at the high level segment of the COP. And this is music to my ears, actually. And frankly speaking, as Ambassador Puri mentioned, there are only two ways to basically respond to climate change. One is mitigation and the other is adaptation. There has been a lot of emphasis on the mitigation to climate change, frankly, because I think the focus was on reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and the concentration levels of those gases so that we could contain the change in the climate itself. But now we realize we are into it and would be experiencing it. In fact, we are experiencing it, as we're speaking. So for the next many decades, we would continue to experience these changes, even if we were to decide to basically stabilize today. So ideally, we are all in it together. Of course, for a country like India, which is a large developing country with a huge agrarian society, with many people dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods, we stand to be affected the most. Many sectors which are sensitive to the changes in the climate, directly affected by the changes in the climate that we're talking about, changes in rainfall patterns, changes in temperatures, etc., which will directly affect their living and their livelihoods, would be the ones who would be largely affected. So India, having almost 600 million people living in rural areas, dependent on agriculture directly or indirectly for their livelihoods, would we basically foresee that the impacts are likely to be quite huge for a large number of people who are dependent on such sectors which are climate sensitive for their livelihoods. And the impacts are going to be on, so very simply put, I normally say everything under the sun is going to change and everybody is going to get affected. We're talking about how sectors are going to get affected. So it's agriculture, forests and biodiversity, the health sector getting impacted, coastal regions getting affected, and then of course, basically, the water resources, how they're likely to get affected with changes in rainfall patterns. So all sectors are likely to get affected, and each one of us, human systems and natural systems, which are connected to these systems that I'm talking about, will also basically have implications given the changes that we would be observing in those sectors. So ideally, while natural systems and human systems would get affected, at the end of the day, each one of us will also feel the pinch of it at our own levels, whether it's related to food being provided on your table at a certain cost, or it's about water being available to us, freely 24/7 in certain cases, or in terms of health the risks to health that we basically foresee, and therefore need for better health infrastructure and support services. So a whole lot of things that are connected. And Prime Minister mentioned there are links to development, and I do think there are direct links to development. When we're talking about adaptation, of course, global support for local adaptation, but that basically means a lot needs to be done in terms of doing development in a way where basically we are addressing the concerns related to climate change and are able to reduce the risk related to climate change and adapt better.
Right. Professor Joshi, staying with this theme of climate adaptation that Prime Minister has emphasized, and he's also making a case for developing countries like India. Help us understand, as far as this, I mean, it's strange, even this phrase is not very common in climate vocabulary. Over the days we were talking about climate change initiatives, we've been using the word mitigation more than usage of the word adaptation. Help us understand, how do the developed countries and developing countries and poorer countries, their pattern of adaptation, their challenge of climate adaptation vary in the situation that we are at the moment?
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me here. As Suruchi mentioned, there are two pathways to address climate change: mitigation and adaptation.
Right.
Mitigation is more of an intervention which often needs funding and also some scientific inputs, whereas adaptation, it addresses the short-term goals as well as the long-term goals. To me, adaptation is more of a sustained kind of steps,
engagement
which,
with these,
any community can take. And I'm proud, I'm glad seeing Prime Minister talking about this, because most of the scientific evidences which were coming from the tropical world, Asian countries and the developing countries, they were repeatedly mentioning about adaptation to be looked at. And the beauty is, adaptation is not like one size fits all. And this is what Prime Minister has emphasized while referring to local adaptation, which might need global support. So to me, it is a very scientific way of looking at climate change and the steps to combat that. Plus, he very nicely quoted the example of agriculture and the agrarian community. Though all the ecosystems, entire range of life forms and different sectors, they get affected because of climate change. But agriculture is one which is very heavily and very hardly hit by the changes in temperature and changes in the precipitation regimes. There are examples from many parts of the country wherein the sowing window has changed or the harvesting window has changed, even the ripening of the fruits, flowers, and in totality, entire the acreage, the production which is there, that is getting affected. But if you look at actually on the ground, talk to common people, so they will also refer to that the soil moisture is getting lost because of the rise on temperature, and also pest, many other kind of problems are there. So herein, adaptation is the one which comes as a very natural way of fitting oneself into the changing climatic regimes, changing patterns of temperature and changing patterns of precipitation. So this is something, as I said, a sustained long-term vision for addressing any of the sectors. So this is something very nice, seeing Prime Minister putting it in the best of the meetings of COP and giving a lateral thought to rest of the world, the way everybody was talking about net zero emissions or say mitigation options.
Right. At that point, Suruchi ma'am, if I can come to you, when he talks about adaptation and he gives example of initiatives that have taken place in India, which we otherwise may end up looking at as isolated development programs, whether it is Swachh Bharat Abhiyan or the plan to get drinking water to every household, or the initiatives that have been made for the workers in the agrarian sector. How do we see these initiatives also in the larger context of climate initiatives, because often we see them as individual efforts to bring about a change in the society?
So there are many development programs which have a great potential to contribute to adaptation. I'm just giving an example of one, which is the Integrated Watershed Management and Development Program. And if you look at this particular program, it has been implemented in India since the late 1980s. So it's already been like some 30-40 years, and India has been basically implementing integrated watershed development management programs. across different parts of the country. Now, this particular program of the Government of India has huge potential in terms of contributing to adaptation. And if you mark my words, I'm using the word contributing to adaptation, and it's not adaptation to climate change. And the reason why I'm using that word, quote unquote, contributing, is they are not adaptation programs per se. They need to be reviewed. They need to be assessed from the point of view of the potential to contribute to reducing the climate risks that we are talking about. They have to be contextualized to the nature of the risks that we are talking about. As you may see, that all regions don't experience the same kind of risks. For example, we by now know the large patterns that we basically observe across different parts of the country. For example, Uttarakhand, prone to floods, flash floods, Mumbai, getting waterlogged and heavy precipitation even. So there are certain patterns that basically we observe. So we know those patterns, and therefore if there are certain programs and schemes that have the potential to contribute to adaptation, they need to be assessed in terms of their performance with regard to a changing climate. And if they would be able to deliver those conditions, well and good. If they were to be done, or what needs to be changed or enhanced in those programs and schemes for them to be able to contribute to adaptation. So all these programs and streams, and we cannot use them as synergistic words. You know, development is just not adaptation. We're talking about a development plus approach, which links the climate concerns and the risks context into the development programs, and sees whether those development programs can deliver under those conditions to be able to basically contribute to adaptation. And that's where the difference is.
Right. Ambassador Puri, I want to return to that very important statement that Prime Minister made, global support for local adaptation. We've been talking about adaptation. I want to talk about the first part of it, global support. And the moment I say it, I'm also concerned. Over the days, we've been talking about global commitments that have been made by the developed countries, for the developing countries, for the poorer countries, and whether those commitments were met with, were fulfilled over the years. How do we understand the phrase global support here, and in what manner are we hoping this will pan out?
You know, fundamentally speaking, we all look at the issue of global support not just because there is a historic responsibility of the developed countries, but also because they have the capacities to be able to provide the support which many in the developing world do not have the abilities for. What are some of the granular aspects? Certainly money, finance, certainly technology, but let me also add another thing, capacities. The knowledge required to be able to undertake these kind of actions, which are absolutely necessary. Now, let me talk at the main issue of finance, which in a sense, many people would say money is fungible and you can do everything with it. You can buy technology, you can buy capacities and so on. What has the developed world really done? In 2009, in the COP in Copenhagen, there was a promise of $100 billion a year. We haven't come anywhere near that money. Today, we are reiterating it. Yesterday, the G20 summit, which had the largest economies, reaffirmed that particular thing. So therefore, when the Prime Minister makes this point, he makes it quite clear that those who have the capacities, please ensure that in the interest of humankind, and indeed in your own interest, do support those who don't have the ability. Secondly, we come to technology. Now, technology is certainly one of the most important pillars which will help us undertake not just adaptation, but even mitigation efforts. Wherein lie the largest amount of technology innovation ability? They lie in the largest industrialized countries of the world. What are they doing in terms of undertaking basic research which can result in mitigation of climate change? What are they doing further with whatever research they've done about sharing it, and sharing it in a manner that is affordable for the large parts of the world which is in the developing countries? The answer is precious little. So when we come to capacities, when we come to knowledge, there isn't very much. Therefore, once again, let me underline this point. Need for adaptation, absolutely paramount, generally forgotten. Very good that it's on the table. Support. This is something which has been on the table for a very long time. Many in the industrialized world, in fact, look at support, i.e. finances in the main, as a kind of bait to get the developing countries, the large developing countries, to be pushed to undertake fundamentally what you may say mitigation actions, even if it means a certain degree of curtailment of their development imperative. I hope that this COP will once again not just reaffirm the commitments, but actually make those who are capable, that is the best, the biggest of the developed countries, to walk the talk on support. And support certainly includes finances, technology, and capacity.
Right. Professor Joshi, what are your thoughts on, as far as global support is concerned, in terms of, as Ambassador Puri just mentioned, capacity, money and technology? Over the years, how has that sort of played out? I mean, we've seen newer technology making their way in the country. We're seeing more electric cars and similar technology, conversations on green hydrogen, for which a lot of advanced technologies are also shared and taken from countries that already have them. But broadly, with the urgency with which we need to sort of have access to these technologies, and developing countries need to have access to these technologies, what is your understanding of the manner in which it has panned out so far?
Well, definitely, if one is interested to bring a change, finance is needed, technology is needed, and the capacity is needed as well. But at the same time, when we are talking about these changes, these are not the abrupt changes. These are the transitional changes which need to take place. And to have those transitional changes, capacity is something very important. How to bring that delta change and then subsequently take it forward. So I see this having a global support for the local adaptation is something necessary, and it is very nicely being narrated by the Prime Minister, and it has actually developed a newer discourse, taking a drift from mitigation to adaptation. I would also like to just add on, we also talked about two very contrasting things. One is the traditional knowledge, which was again, though the scientific community was repeatedly mentioning about that, but when it was coming to the policy level, and at least at the global policy level, often people were missing that. And the second thing, as an academic, which I found something very interesting is, wherein he talked about bringing course curricula and training or teaching the kids onto that. So that is a true sustainable development approach. You are preparing the next generation towards that. So overall, I see it a very encouraging kind of take, and the way it has been placed there at the COP.
That was an important point. Suruchi ma'am, if I can bring that point to you, making climate change conversation studies a part of formal education. So far, what we see, a lot of youth activists who have rightfully gained a lot of limelight, acting from certain fringes and trying to make their voice heard. What difference do you think would it make when climate change conversations become a part of a formal curriculum? What kind of cascading effect will that likely to bring?
So we do need to have that cascading effect and have the youth involved in the discussions that we are having related to climate change, because we are leaving behind a world to the next generation, which is already changing and is likely to continue to change. And this is a world that is going to be owned by them, in which they will be living. Therefore, they better understand what they're in for and what kind of experiences they would be going through as they would be seeing all these changes, and at a much faster, rapid rate than what we have experienced in our lifetime. So definitely, I think we have to have the youth on board. We need to have them understand what are we talking about,
right.
And we also need, solutions from them. And in certain cases, sometimes you find the youth coming up with some interesting, innovative, creative ideas to think about. And you can also see at the global level, many of the things are being, the advocacy part of it, it's pretty visible from the younger generation in terms of being very vocal about the issues and talking about it.
Suresh, on that point, in fact, I just want to add that a few weeks ago, there was this UN Day celebrations, and I engaged with some young innovators in the field of environment and climate change. And a point that they had to make, one of them, was that, and she was an engineer, and the entire classroom of engineers, there was just one project that was aimed at sustainable development. Everything else fit into the conventional engineering stream. So, so this point that you're making, that making the youngsters part of the solution in a more active and a wholesome manner is crucial.
Yeah, and all the more because they are going to basically take things forward, and it would be good that we engage them right from the beginning. So include it in the course schools, in the course curricula, and also at the college, university levels, so that people are aware of the issues, and they're already thinking about the solutions, as they are growing and basically, entering career paths. So they are very much part of the system and the solution, and they're already thinking in that direction. I think it's a very important thing to do. So raising awareness and building capacity has to be something that has to be done apart from the focus on mitigation, hardcore mitigation, adaptation that we're talking about, interventions that need to be looked at, whether in the form of policies, regulation, technology, or assistance for climate finance. On the other hand, I think education systems and building of institutional capacities and capabilities to deliver on the ground would also be very crucial in terms of the actions and for pushing forth the implementation that we're looking for.
Right. Ambassador Puri, we noticed that this is the second time that Prime Minister has referred to lifestyle changes in the G20 intervention also, and now also he says lifestyle changes to promote adaptation is the way forward. Now, the word lifestyle also interestingly brings into the context the responsibility, and correct me if I'm wrong, not just institutions but also individuals from developed countries, from developing countries, and from poorer nations. How significant do you think this reference is being made again and again by Prime Minister?
I think the significance of changes in lifestyle and making them sustainable is something that can hardly be understated. It's absolutely imperative. Much of the industrialized world would like us to believe that the solutions to climate change lie just in decarbonization. Now, decarbonization is certainly important. No one denies that. But I think we need to understand that we are aiming at sustainability. And for sustainability, we need to look at profligate lifestyles. We need to look at unsustainable consumption and production patterns. And I am glad that India has once again taken the lead to bring this to the fore. The G20 statement mentioned the need for sustainable production and consumption. Lifestyles have been brought in. And these are all things which are particularly important and things that can be done even at the level of the individual. Needless to say, however, it's not just action at the level of the individuals, at the level of societies, economies, countries, etc. is needed. But the recognition, and herein lies another interesting point. Most developing countries, and India is a particularly good example, possibly as a result of the fact that profligation and our abilities to undertake profligation is very limited. We happen to be, by standards, fairly sustainable societies, and our lifestyles are generally sustainable and more constrained as compared to what you've seen in the developed world, where especially in the last 40, 50 years, you've seen a plethora of consumerism and profligate spending, unsustainable kinds of consumption as well as production. Indeed, I'm very much reminded that, the planet has enough for everybody's need, but it's greed which is the problem, as Mahatma Gandhi mentioned. And, we need to control this greed. And the Prime Minister bringing it to the fore, I think is again particularly important. Somebody mentioned here the question of young people. I sincerely hope that they are listening. No answer to climate change, sustainability can be done without the participation of those who have the greatest stake, and that is the future generation. And they need to understand. Good, convenient, comfortable lifestyle, why not? All of us want it. But let us also ensure it is sustainable, it is environmentally friendly, and it's something which helps protect the planet. And indeed, let me say, not just the planet, but protects humanity. because that is really what we are trying to do and achieve for the future generation.
Right. Professor Joshi, from you, we'd like to learn a little more about this theme of lifestyle changes, because it really, the moment we talk about it, it broadens our conversation in the context of climate action, because it then, I think we're also talking about the culture in which we are growing up, the culture in which youngsters are growing up, the manner in which international economy works, the manner in which consumption, consumerism do not have a limitation or an end, you know. They don't operate in a context, but profit is something sort of that drives our economies. How significant is to then reflect on lifestyle changes as a defining factor if any climate action or climate change in a positive way is to be made a reality?
Well, you know, there is a term ecosystem, wherein, you know, human being is one part of entire life forms. But what we see is, you know, this ecosystem is getting converted or has actually gone to something called as ecosystem. Whereas human being is trying to harness, trying to exploit any of the resources beyond its need. So that is what the lifestyle is, you know, going beyond something what you need, and then doing the unsustainable way of extraction of resources. It could be fuel wood, it could be, aggregating the fodder, and also the lifestyles which are there actually in the main city centers. You know, excessive use of energy, excessive use of wasting food items, or going beyond what actually you need for a better living. So it is just not the climate change which will be addressed by having a sustainable lifestyle, rather the entire set of global environmental issues which are over there. You know, these all somewhere are tagged with the unsustainable use of energy, unsustainable use of commodities or the resources which are around. So sustainability has actually emerged as a mantra, and this COVID has given us a wonderful teaching. You know, when we all were locked down and we all stayed within homes, we got to understand that we, there is no need of over expending on many of the things which otherwise as a normal life we were doing. So getting reoriented towards a lifestyle which is more sustainable in nature will certainly be giving many of the benefits to the challenges of climate change. But it will also be addressing many of the global environmental problems which are there, whether it is biodiversity loss, whether it is groundwater depletion, pollution of air, or other kind of, extraction of natural resources, which are basically becoming day by day unsustainable in nature. So precisely, it's not the tropical countries, it is the entire world which has to relook into this, reboot the way, a lifestyle is dictating many of the things in day-to-day activities. And that will certainly bring in a delta change in many of the aspects of environmental problems which are over there. And again, when it comes to teaching, bringing these kind of things in the course curricula, we have a contrasting examples of environmental sciences, disasters, which are often taught when somebody actually gets into a college level or say higher secondary level. But bringing it right from the primary education will be giving a lesson, appropriate learning to kids, and it will definitely be impacting their thought process, their style of working when it comes to the lifestyle. So that will be benefiting us in multiple facets to me.
Right. And Ambassador Puri, lifestyle changes to promote climate adaptation. Do you also see that the world is at a very crucial juncture? Yesterday at G20, we were talking about economic recovery, the world opening up again, trade, tourism and other engagements opening up again. And this may be a great time to do it in a new way and Shanti, I mean, I know it's easier said than done, but at least from the vision perspective, it could be a crucial time, a special time to sort of change our ways.
You're very right. Whenever we have disasters, we say build back better. Now, in this context of COVID, we all say build back greener. No doubt about that at all. But this is where leadership comes into play. And you have to take certain calls. The global economy saw a downturn of nearly 6 to 7% last year, something that has never been seen before in recent times. You have little choice but to ramp up the global economy. So does India, which saw a nearly 10% fall in its GDP. Now, given these circumstances, yes, it's good, and we must try and see what best we can do in terms of building back sustainably, building back greener. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind about it. But leaders also have the responsibility of, let me say, urgent action. And sometimes a lot of that has to be done in the way you are doing it, because you've had such a catastrophic fall that you really need to provide support and succor to your people. But let me leave one other thought with you. While adaptation, mitigation, each of these things have their technical aspects, I'm a bit of an old-fashioned person who believes that finally it is development which is the cause and really the bedrock of resilience and indeed adaptation. Countries which are rich would be able to undertake much more adaptation. Their resilience levels are far more. So those who are poor, they are vulnerable. They remain at the bottom end of things. So in that sense, when you look at it, development and growth per se are perhaps the bedrocks of your abilities to be able to manage change, adapt to change. Of course, if you can bring about the growth through greening, and I think countries like India are doing a lot on that. Let me just take a minute of your time and draw your attention to the kind of actions that India is taking. The renewable efforts on India's part, 450 gigawatts by 2030. No other country in the world is taking such a big bet on renewable. Electrifying the Indian railways. These are some of the big things, and we are taking them at the same time while we are faced with the greatest of vulnerabilities. Look at what floods have done in India, cyclones that we've had, and tackling each and every one of these things. So renewables, building resilience, each and every one of them is important, and I think we are striking a particularly good balance.
Right, those are absolutely valid points. Suruchi ma'am, invariably we return to our conversations return to the point where we talk about the manner in which climate action is also affected by the manner in which rich developing countries, poorer countries make our international order. The responsibility that must be shared by the developed countries, the carbon space that must be distributed in an equitable way. So the lifestyle changes that we are talking about. Do you also see that developed countries must take a certain priority and urgency with which they address these needs, as they must in case of emissions?
Definitely. It's been a long-standing debate actually in developed countries in terms of talking about their lifestyles, their consumptive lifestyles, and which is not comparable to anywhere with the developing world. For example, the US is 17 times more consumptive easily compared to India. So if we start looking at the statistics and comparing, world data in terms of looking at how countries have been consuming and the lifestyles being led within those countries, there's a big comparison, a stark comparison that we can see between the developed and the developing world, and therefore this has been a long-standing agenda in terms of basically asking the developed world to reduce the ecological footprint and their carbon footprint, which may help address the issues we are talking about in terms of mitigating climate change. And therefore, the reason why the burden was put heavily on the developed countries initially, and with the objective to see them contribute more in terms of the reductions initially, which was then to be followed by other countries, with developing countries joining in. But given the way the negotiations have gone over the years and the contributions that we see, basically a large amount of that space is already being utilized. If you look at the historical burden and the emissions that have been released into the atmosphere, largely from the developed countries, their consumptive lifestyles, and therefore the issue of equity and justice and the space that the developing world needs to basically grow. So all of this connects very conveniently from one to the other. And while we do now emphasize on the fact of focusing on consumptive lifestyles and reductions in that and the footprints, simultaneously we're also looking in-house and seeing what we can do as a country, or for example, India, the areas where India can basically improve in terms of promoting sustainable lifestyles, and this is something that every country should be focusing on. But if you look at it from the carbon footprint point of view, definitely the burden is, it's much more burdened on the developed country side, and therefore the contributions, as we say, we do expect that they take a much larger role in terms of basically reducing and moving towards a net zero. And as you also see, India has been saying that we would first like to see what other countries put on the table, and then we basically go in net zero before India actually assesses for its own self when will it basically be able to follow the same path. So and there's nothing wrong in what India is saying actually, and it's basically based on a lot of data that goes behind it, and the historical burden and the burden sharing we talk about.
Professor Joshi, if you could give us some insights about the point that Suruchi ma'am just mentioned about Prime Minister talking about lifestyle changes across the world, but the changes that we have been able to brought about in our context in India, wherein we are through that demonstrating our commitment to climate action. If you could take us through some examples of which, I think there would be some in the agriculture field in particular, the manner in which we've brought that about. If you could just take us through the steps that India has already taken, which could be seen as an example for the world to notice.
Well, one of the things is, in the front of renewable energy, the kind of commitments which are over there. So now green hydrogen is being talked about in addition to solar and wind, photovoltaic, those kind of things. That is a excellent example, and with a 175 gigawatt achieved, that sets a very clear-cut, commitment which countries.
You're right, sir. In fact, farmers using solar power to run their water pumps is an excellent example of the manner in which lifestyle changes, I think, could be brought about.
Yes.
Please go on, sir. Yes.
Yeah, and then at the behest of this interventions or the investments which are there in renewable energy, so you have your transport sector, you have your agriculture sector, which is getting hugely benefited. Like the one example which you gave, instead of depending more on electricity or other alternate fossil fuels or other alternate sources of energy. So renewable energy is bringing a lot of benefit to the local communities, whether it is Himalayan mountains or the forest areas of central India. Then there are many of the interventions which are taking place in the agriculture sector, the way fertilizer or the drought resistant species which are coming up, and the way irrigation was being done. So the newer term of precision agriculture is coming into picture, wherein the land could be mapped in the sub-inches level, and the nutrients requirement of soil could be estimated. So it is adding one way, the investment which was
drop irrigation, sir, I think in the same context,
and then certainly, yeah. And then there is insurance which is coming, which is addressing the issues of climate change induced disasters. So agriculture insurance has actually come in a very big way in the country. Right. So likewise, the forestry sector, if you look at, the kind of commitment which has come for 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent green cover has to be increased. So recently government invested on Campa and rediverted the funds so that the urban green covers could be increased. There is a policy of Nagar 1 which is enhanced, and there are 200 cities which are earmarked for such kind of things. So what I see, country has bring in all the sectors some kind of very clear-cut changes, and these changes are actually showing some kind of better expectations as well as results, which are a wonderful example for the global arena, and many of the world leaders, they are appreciating this, and that is probably the reason, whether it is US, whether it was Sweden or other countries, Poland, they are coming much forward and shaking hand with India to fight or to address the issues of climate change together. So these are some of the examples which I can cite.
Right. Ambassador Puri, the Prime Minister has time and again, not just the present summit, spoken on the importance of disaster resilient infrastructure on international platforms. Now, for a layperson to understand, this year itself, there's no dearth of natural disasters that we've witnessed. We've seen unprecedented forest fires. We've seen climate rise and summers in Europe that the continent had never seen before. In our own subcontinent, the floods and other disasters have been more devastating than before. Is then this a good time for the world to take note and do more about this vision of a disaster resilient infrastructure? Because then everyone will have to pitch in. Prime Minister may have mentioned the vision, but every country will have to play a part in making that a reality.
Well, India has been in the lead on this.
Yes.
We have set up the coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure, and all the major countries in the world have either joined or are in the process of joining. So the world has recognized this. Of course, the CDRI goes beyond simply the climate ones.
Yes.
It includes earthquakes, for example,
yes,
which are not climate related. But climate related events and difficult events for the world to cope with are on the increase, whether it is those which have something to do with melts of snowfall, whether it's fires, whether it's ocean related events. Each of these we are seeing at an increase. So the impact of climate change, particularly on countries such as in South Asia, which are particularly vulnerable, but we've seen that all across. We've seen it in the United States, in the west coast of the United States. We've seen fires in Australia.
Absolutely.
We've seen these all across in every part of the world. And so the fact that the world must recognize that they need to build resilience is an integral part of adaptation. And infrastructure, which is, the backbone of your economies. So when you are building infrastructure, isn't it a good idea that you make the infrastructure, what should I say, disaster resilient? Why? Because you are putting in money that is expected to last you 40, 50 years. Please ensure that today, not only do you use the right technology, but you use technology which promotes sustainability, because this is going to be there for a long run. And it should hurt the environment, rather it should protect and nurture the environment, because that's in everybody's goal and everybody's good. And I therefore happy that once again this is yet another element of adaptation which got highlighted. And let's hope that the world actually starts acting on this, not just domestically but globally.
Right. And Suruchi ma'am, talking about disaster resilient infrastructure, do you again see over this theme as well, the world would be divided into developed, developing and poorer countries? The ways in which island nations we know are more vulnerable to natural disasters, and they've also sort of spoken about the urgency of acting not just in a better manner but also quickly. So do you see the needs and requirements of developing